Welcome to episode 97 of I Thought I Knew How, a podcast about knitting and life and all sorts. I'm your host, Anne Frost, and this episode was recorded on March 24th, 2023. I have a returning guest today. There haven't been very many of those, but I wanted to have Elizabeth Williamson back to talk about preserving heritage crafts, something she is very passionate about in the context of Shetland lace knitting. What makes something a heritage craft, and why are they worth preserving, and how? We have some thoughts to share. Let's get to it. First, thank you to the newest patrons of the I Thought I Knew How podcast, Joanne and Beth. Thank you for coming on as sponsors of the show. You and all of my patrons help keep the lights on here, and I appreciate it greatly. If you'd like to come on board the production team, please visit patreon.com/I-thought-I-knew-how to learn about the benefits available to you as a thank you for helping move the show forward. Special thanks also go out to Knit New Haven and Morehouse Merino Flock for sponsoring the podcast. Knit New Haven provides supplies and classes for fiber artists in the New Haven area. We are coming up to the time of year where people start planning for summer trips. If you find yourself heading to Connecticut or even to New York, New Haven is a lovely little city to include in your itinerary with museums and restaurants to fill your day and a visit to Knit New Haven to fill your stash. Learn more at knitnewhaven.com. The Morehouse Merino Flock Group continues to grow and grow. There are dozens of projects with all the instructions and videos you need to complete them successfully. And if you do need personal help, that's what Erin is there for. Hop into a group knitting time or send her an email and she'll make sure to get you back on track. Learn more at morehousemerinoflock.com. As I said at the start, I have an interview with Elizabeth Williamson for you today. Last time she was on, we talked about her history as a Shetland lace knitter. And just recently, Elizabeth announced that she is going to be doing a free talk for those who are interested in the history of Shetland lace. And I wanted to have her on the show to talk to her about these talks that she's doing and about the preservation of heritage crafts generally. First of all, why are some crafts referred to as heritage crafts while others are just crafts or handiwork? And why does it matter? And how can we as knitters and crafters, as designers, and as advocates for these heritage crafts ensure that they get preserved and not diffused into the larger crafting landscape? Because Elizabeth is a Shetland lace knitter and the preservation of that craft is her main focus, we use her experiences and insights into the preservation of that particular heritage craft as a framework for the discussion. Do please enjoy my talk with Shetland lace knitter and designer Elizabeth Williamson. Elizabeth, thank you for coming back on the show. It is so good to see you again.
Excellent. Lovely to see you, Anne.
I wanted to have you back on the show. First of all, so people should know that you were on the show. Was it this last Shetland Wool Week that you came on the show? Yeah.
Yep.
They all start to blend together in my mind. So there is an interview with Elizabeth from a few months ago where we talked about Shetland lace and her experience growing up around Shetland lace knitters and teaching Shetland lace. And today I wanted to have you on to talk about just sort of generally about preserving heritage crafts, because Shetland lace is on the endangered list of heritage crafts there in the UK. And maybe you could start by talking about what that means to be on the endangered list.
In the UK, we've got a Heritage Craft Association. And what they have done is they've looked at crafts within the UK and have identified ones that are at risk. And then they have the red list, a bit like you have animals on the red list for going into extinction. And they have placed Shetland lace knitting on the red list now because of the number of people who are actually knitting lace as like a profession and know the heritage of, and they have placed it on that endangered list.
Yeah, so that is an important distinction to make. It's not that there's only a handful of people knitting Shetland lace in Shetland. It's that there's only a handful doing it professionally still.
Yes, I think that's one of the key points is just actually because a lot of people obviously no longer make a living with knitting. They still knit, but it is that, I think that definition, I could be wrong, but I think that's when I read through the specification, there's not very many people who are actually doing it anymore.
Yeah. That's how I remember it too. So if we're wrong together.
Yes. That's good.
So I know that you have been teaching at Shetland Wool Week for a few years now, and you are starting to branch out to some of the other festivals to teach Shetland lace, and you have your online Shetland lace classes that you teach. And what is your goal in teaching Shetland lace beyond the borders of Shetland?
Well, after Shetland Wool Week asked me to be their online tutor in 2021, then I just saw the demand and people were really interested in Shetland lace. And obviously then finding out that it was on the red list. And obviously I'm, as you know, me and other people who've listened to interviews of mine in the past, then I'm really passionate about Shetland lace, preserving the history, techniques and everything else, and just making sure it's not lost, because it would be really sad if it did get lost through time. And so I suppose it's just having that enthusiasm and love for it that I like to, and I hope I pass on to other people and they enjoy doing it. And so that's what I really just want to keep it going, preserve our heritage. I know I come from a small island in the middle of the sea, but it is just because these things are important to me. They're important. It's my heritage, it's my culture, and it's good to keep. It's like how I know how over time things change and things progress and develop, and that's good, and we all like to do that. I have to admit that I do a lot of Shetland lace knitting in more contemporary styles that you wouldn't have found in the past, but it is just to keep a lot of that tradition and history and that handed down information through generations, and just keep that, because it can get lost. Like, it's even within our dialect that then it's obviously being over time gets watered down and it isn't as strong as it was. And I just think some things are really worth preserving, or we've become one homogenous group of people, which is good, but it's because we all can, but it's also really good just to preserve our individuality a little bit as well.
Yeah, it's interesting. That's an interesting connection between the dialect or language, depending on who you ask, versus the what's happening with Shetland knitting, because it is easy for dialect speakers. You see it everywhere, to just sort of pick up words from another language that's spoken in the area and incorporate it, and how that slowly shifts things. And so are you seeing examples of that with Shetland lace, where people are sort of taking Shetland lace and incorporating other things and still calling it Shetland lace?
You do see that. You see things that are creeping into what people say, oh, this is Shetland lace. But when I would say myself and other Shetland lace knitters look at it, there's recognisable bits at Shetland lace. It could be better called as inspired by Shetland lace, rather than Shetland lace itself. It could be inspired by, because it's got elements of, and it's got elements of other knitting in it and elements from other areas. So to me, that would be more lace knitting. And there's nothing wrong with lace knitting at all. We all love lace knitting. But specifically to be Shetland, I would say that it wouldn't be recognisably as a full, what you would think of as Shetland lace knitting. So inspired by Shetland lace, I think, is a term that should be used more. And even in my own knitting, like I've knitted something and I've said it was lace, but it was inspired by Fair Isle knitting. And so it's using that word inspiration, isn't it?
Yeah. So I think even to take it a step further, if designers were to be clear about what the elements are, everyone, we are past the days of designers trying to fit their pattern design on the front and back of a sheet, right? When we buy patterns now, they can be 20 pages long because people get them as digital copies and people incorporate, what they were thinking when they designed it, and photos and close-up tutorials along the way. And so it would be very helpful both for the knitter who's learning about knitting and the heritage craft, And for the preservation of the craft, if they actually spelled out, this edging is a traditional Shetland pattern, or these motifs are, but the shape, I've applied it to a more modern shape, or, I've incorporated this other motif that you don't traditionally find with Shetland lace, but all the others are Shetland lace.
Yeah.
Sort of. Because I know you were saying before when we were talking, like, you're not the lace police, right? You're not trying to say you can't do this, you can't do that, but there is value in preserving Shetland lace as Shetland lace and helping make it clear for people what that is, what that looks like.
It is, but the thing is, within Shetland, and I say this in all my classes to people, within Shetland, again, we're a small island, but within the area, there's lots of different ways to do things.
Yeah.
And just because I and my family going back 100 plus years have been knitting it in this way, just that's the way that my family did it in that area. Doesn't mean that the way that somebody in Unst did it, that their way is different. What we want to do is make Shetland lace survive. And we want it not to be diluted, but we want people to enjoy doing it, and we want it to be incorporated into lots of different designs and knitting and everything else, because that's what makes knitting fun and interesting and everything else. And so we don't want to, and I would never say, well, that way is wrong or this way is wrong. I would just go, well, that's not the way that I was taught how to do it. I was taught this way, so this is the way I do it, and this is the way that I'm teaching you, and I can go backwards to go why I do that.
Right.
And if you speak probably to the ladies in Unst, or you speak to the people for the South End or West Side of Shetland, you'll find that they also have that traditional way of learning. So from grannies or great aunts, or in my mum's case, she was taught to knit by an uncle. So you've got that where the information comes from. And that's the way they do it because that was the way they were told how to do it. And you've got that heritage, isn't it? And so within Shetland, we do things differently. But that's what makes it Shetland lace as well, because we do it differently, but it still ultimately still has the same looks of when you see their hats and you see shawls in knitted lace items. They've got enough of that same connection bits in it that is recognisably over, say, when you look at something and you can see Estonian lace or Faroese or Icelandic, they still have similar elements in them, but then they do look different.
Maybe another way to think about it would be to think about Aran knitting, the cable knits, and people always love to say, every family had their own cable pattern. That's most likely not true. It's most likely that, again, people in certain areas were doing it certain ways and sort of following each other, learning off each other. And so different sort of styles evolved, but it's all Aran knitting. It's all different ways of producing a cabled cloth. And we see the same thing in Shetland lace knitting, where, different clusters of knitters are learning off one another and copying each other, but it's still all Shetland lace.
And because you'll find even the same patterns or motifs, they'll have different names. People call them different things, but they're exactly the same, but people might have different names for them, but they look exactly the same, but they will have different names for it.
There definitely is that value in the preservation. As you said, like this is more than just a craft. This really is a heritage that's tied to family lines, family groupings, genealogies, histories of people. And I think it can be a sensitive topic for people who are still part of that continuum, to see people who maybe don't fully understand it, who are maybe being more playful with it without making it clear that they're being playful with it.
Yeah, I suppose it's what you're saying, isn't it? That I come from in my heritage, I'm coming from, and I'm trying to preserve the ways and the things that my great granny taught and the way she did things. And it's looking after that, because I feel I'm very privileged. Because I have this brilliant job, or now I've got a platform that people do listen, and I get to tell people all about it, all about knitting, all about techniques and skills and tips and all this kind of things. And I get to pass that on. I feel like now I'm passing that on. I wish my children would listen to me more. Might do when they get older, but it's having that now, and people are interested in it, and I feel that we can keep that going. Other people, when they're doing, and after they've done like my mini hat class, they will then go and tell other people, and they'll be talking about Elizabeth's granny and and things that, when they in the past, and they will then tell stories that they have had me telling about Shetland. And it's not just the knitting heritage, it's obviously coming from Shetland. It is the knitting words. Like everybody now, hopefully, if you've been in any of my classes in every school, everybody knows that this is, you can't probably see it, this is a tapestry needle, but we would call it a grafter. So everybody now, if you bring in my class, you know that this is a grafter. And it's preserving that dialect with knitting, and it's the sheep, and it's the crofts, and it's life, it's all together. It's not just this individual standalone thing, it's all the history and everything that comes along with it, that I think it's all worth preserving and looking after as well, so we don't lose all that information.
You've mentioned your classes. We are very lucky to be living in this day and age that we do, where we can learn from teachers such as yourself who are involved in a heritage craft directly through Zoom from, the other side of the planet, if we want to, as well as, I guess I would say, pre-pandemic times when people would make the trip to Shetland to learn directly from people who are teaching lace knitting. How has, your ability to teach online, how has that affected you as a Shetland lace aficionado and promoter? in your thoughts about the ability to teach online in the preservation of the craft?
Initially, I obviously had reservations on how well you could teach online, because obviously coming from the tradition of you sat in a room next to somebody, they showed you what to do, you did it, and just having that traditional teaching method. But actually, the feedback that I've gotten from lots of people is that doing it online, it's like having me in the living room. And my classes, I keep them to be small group sizes, because then it just makes it a bit more intimate, and that way everybody gets to know everybody and they can chat, and it has a much more cozy, homely, and that's kind of in that tradition of learning. But doing it online and having a camera solely for my hands, it is that way that if you were in a workshop perhaps and you've got 15 other people, it's actually sometimes quite hard, unless you've got, say, a projector or something, to see what the tutor's actually doing. Whereas actually online, you can closely see what's in my hand and then stop and say, I didn't get that bit. Could you repeat it? I can demonstrate it again, and you can go over it. I do believe we all learned lots of things from YouTube, and I have done as well. But having the ability to actually have online classes, you can ask, I didn't get that. Because I've watched YouTube videos and go, nope, still don't get that. Yeah. Still don't know. And what does she do at that bit? I've lost that bit. They didn't get that. But in class, obviously, people can say, no, I'm sorry, I didn't get that. Or could you please do it again? Or do you mind repeating that technique? And it's obviously that interactive ability. And I really enjoy the classes, and hopefully all my students do as well.
And that's not to say, that there definitely still is value in being there in person and being able to see your beautiful work right up front and touch. It's great to be able to touch the things too. What are your thoughts about the Shetland Lace project that's going on as a tool for preservation?
I think it's absolutely brilliant. I think it's a really great thing to be doing, is they're looking closely at all the items that they have in the museum. And that's what I do speak about, is that obviously knitting isn't the best for being preserved. So all that things that my great granny knitted, none of them survive. Because also in that they were made, used, and then fell apart. So we do not have any of the haps and things that my great granny knitted for us. We don't have any of those still in existence. And so knitwear is hard to preserve. So I think that the museum preserving the specimens that they do have, but also people looking closely at them and studying the patterns and the designs and recording all the details of these items. I think it's invaluable. It's wonderful. These women created these haps, shawls and other items mostly without charts. They didn't chart things, they didn't write very much down. They are amazing creations. These women were artists. They were just brilliant knitters. And also you've got to remember that a lot of these women, they were knitting to earn money. So that's a whole another aspect of Shetland lace knitting at that time. But obviously they were doing it for money. They didn't necessarily like doing it. I loved when your interview, I didn't mention it earlier because I forgot, but I really loved your interview that you did with Elizabeth Johnson. And it was interesting to hear, you asked her, did you like knitting? No. My mother was asked that question about knitting. No, didn't enjoy it. We get to knit, or I get to knit, because I really enjoy it. Yeah. And I'm privileged. I'm in a time that I'm knitting because I enjoy it. And hopefully people are knitting as well because they're not trying to put food on the table or clothe their children or put shoes on their feet. So these women did these amazing designs and everything else, and it was an industry for them. I'm not trying to detract from the creativity. I'm just trying to say that it's just amazing what they did do and what they were making at that time. And they didn't have all the extra stuff we've got to help support us.
And that's one of the aspects, I think, that makes it, a heritage craft, is because they were doing this for an income, which meant that it had to be creative and appealing and quick and repairable, and something that they could have on and off their needles so that they could have that income come in. And all of those elements and the wool that was produced locally and all of that adds up to Shetland lace and what makes Shetland lace what it is. Whereas if you were to go to Estonia or you were to go to Spain, they were knitting for different reasons. It was different people knitting. They had access to different yarn. They had different visual inspirations. And each of those things deserve to be preserved as well in their special field for what they are. And that doesn't mean that people can't be playful with it, that they can't incorporate different elements of it. But we need to be careful because, I'm someone who was only I was exposed to Shetland lace through Victorian Lace Today in the early 2000s, that book that was published. Yeah. But it didn't dawn on me at that point how unique each heritage craft was, because it was here's a book of a bunch of patterns from the Victorian times, and many of them are Shetland lace patterns. But it's not until I learned more about lace generally and then was able to make the trip to Shetland and see specific examples of Shetland lace that I was able to differentiate in my own mind. Oh, this is what makes Shetland lace different from these other laces I've been looking at that are unique in their own way and special in their own way and also deserve to be preserved. So if I'm just average knitter and I'm being presented with patterns that I think are pretty and I want to knit, and the designer is calling them, a Shetland lace shawl, an Estonian lace stole, but really they're pulling in elements from lots of different things, then in my mind, I'm not going to be able to make those differentiations and understand what makes Shetland lace what it is, what identifies Estonian as what it is, what identifies Spanish, Madeira lace for what it is, So really it's not, I guess it's a call for clarity more than anything, right? Like, everyone wants to know, we're learning creatures. We're curious. Humans are curious, and we have the capacity to learn and understand. So let's make it clearer what we're doing and be okay with the fact maybe that we're being a little playful as a designer. Just be open about it.
Yeah, exactly. Because not everybody, lots of people are not like myself, who spend a lot of time studying lots of lace and looking at lots of different lace patterns in different areas, laces and everything else. So then that's this problem if people are not stating where things come from or acknowledging, I got this from this person, or this person taught me, or this is, by not acknowledging sources or inspiration and everything else. For other people, they just see it and take it at face value because that is what somebody's called it, or they have said this is Shetland lace, or they say this is Estonian, but then it's not. Because we're not, and that's not, it's certainly not as a criticism, because obviously not everybody's as geeky as me. and is passionate about lace, and knows all this, because we can't know everything. And my husband's into different things, and I can't even possibly know all that he knows about plants. My area is knitting. That's what I'm interested in. And so you can't expect other people to have the knowledge or in-depth that you may have. So we have to take, so when I have bought and I've knitted lots of Icelandic lace. I love Icelandic lace. But I have to take, when the designer says it's Icelandic lace, I've got to take that they have been doing and probably have gone through some learning process to make that as like authentically Icelandic, because that's what they're calling it. They're not saying it's just lace, they're calling it specifically Icelandic lace. So then to me that means it has to have characteristics and specifications that make it Icelandic rather than just lace in general. It's like validating your sources, isn't it? Or where have that information's come from to make this like this? So like, is this person being taught by the old lady? Somebody might be in New Zealand, but the old lady next door to them was actually from Scotland, and it was her mother that was from Shetland, but she grew up in Scotland, and now they emigrated to New Zealand, and then they've taught the person next door. So it's not that the person has to come from Shetland, but it has. But it's that.
It's the continuum.
Yes. And the continuum is never straight.
Right. It's never always bound by geography. It's person to person, especially as the world continues to develop the way that it is, and people are more and more mobile. That continuum is going to become more of a worldwide phenomenon.
And I find, and it's really lovely, and I like getting to know people in my class. I know it's meant to be me teaching and telling them things, but I do ask lots of people questions, and I like hearing where people come from. And a lot of people I find out that come to my classes is they want to learn Shetland lace is because actually their granny was from, or there also was a lot of people in Scotland who would knit as well, and they would knit like Shetland lace knitting, but they were Scottish but knitting Shetland lace. And it be transpired that they want to do it because their granny did, but they at that time they didn't learn from their granny, so now they want to learn. And I had this weekend a lady came to she has a connection, obviously, she's Scottish, has a connection to Shetland, or to Shetland knitting. And she been coming to my online classes. She came to a class I had in person, and she brought her daughter. Because then her daughter was then wanting to learn, and her mum was been teaching her. So I feel that I'm now part of their continuum. It does a little funny loop, and get from granny to then to me back to, and then she's brought her daughter who's now interested in knitting. So I just think that's amazing how it kind of bopped back to them, that heritage, through a funny loop via me. And I love that kind of thing, because it's just, and it's making people passionate about a hobby and enjoying something, and they're really enjoying doing it. And that's
there's people who love knitting, and they'll just pick up and they'll knit, and they're happy to knit a hat or knit a scarf or whatever. And then there's those of us who are geeks, and we want to know the differentiations. We want to know what's unique to this, what's unique to that. And history. A lot of those of us who enjoy heritage crafts enjoy history as well, and they just fit right together for obvious reasons. Yeah. So I know we're sort of talking generally about preserving heritage crafts, the importance of heritage crafts, using Shetland lace as an example. But I think I'm going to get in trouble from people if I don't ask you to actually name some things, some elements of Shetland lace that you consider to be sort of markers of Shetland lace. You've already said before, like there's different ways, different people had different ways of doing things. And so it's a bigger umbrella than people sometimes think. But what are some of the things that that you think differentiate Shetland lace from other laces out there, other lace styles?
I think a lot of it is the motifs that are used. Mm-hmm. But then a lot of people go about the cat's paw and how that's Shetland, but that's in Russian lace, in another lace pattern. So it's not just in Shetland lace. Right. There is some motifs that are used a lot in Shetland lace that does. So, for example, the tree. Mm-hmm. And all variations of the tree, upside down, on the side, different styles. So you will see the tree features in a lot of older patterns. You'll see that repeated, but not necessarily in everyone. And I suppose a lot is it that you'll find that people say that all Shetland lace is on a garter base, mm-hmm. but not all Shetland lace is on a garter base. So you've got especially the one that always people refer to as print and the wave. Mm-hmm. That's done, but that also can be done on a garter base. Mm-hmm. A lot of people will try and tell you that Shetland lace is only Shetland lace if it's patterned on both sides, but then that's obviously not true, because half the patterns, more than half, are not. It's only on the and some people will say Shetland lace is only Shetland lace if it's the same on both sides. Mm-hmm. But then that only goes if it's on a garter base. So I'm not really helping you here. I'm giving you examples and taking them away.
Well, but I think you're making the point. Like it's more of a vocabulary, perhaps, than a list of items.
Yeah, and it's the things like lace aging. Mm-hmm. There is a few recognizable ways that when I've looked at samples, now they call it the Unz method, where you cast on the bottom, right, and pick up and then knit the sides at the same time and then knit along the top. Mm-hmm. So
you're knitting the edging on as you progress up.
Yeah. Or there's the method of knitting an item and then knitting the lace aging on, mm-hmm. And then keeping the corner square. Mm-hmm. And it's a technique to have that square corners and preserve the shape of the internal, say, rectangle. So there's just various things that is you look at something and go, I can see then that is being made in that Unz style of lace aging. You can recognize it when you look at it. It's like the hap. You can look at haps and recognize by studying them how they've been made in this construction method. So, and you can kind of recognize that, and from pictures you can tell how people have made them. So it's having that. But the thing is, if somebody then looks at Estonian lace, it just looks different. Mm-hmm. And it has a different, and they have different motifs, and especially the Estonians seem to have really big motifs. Their mm-hmm. motifs a lot of the time are really big, say in the borders of their shawls and things, because they make square shawls as well, right. But their motifs are a different size and a different and not necessarily motifs that you would ever see in Shetland lace. Mm-hmm. And they're also, a lot of them is on stocking stitch. So, but it's the techniques as well of putting how things are put together, which was obviously developed within the islands. Mm-hmm. I think it go back to why women were doing knitting, that you said you wanted to get it on the needles, off the needles. So a lot of these techniques that I teach people is like the easiest possible way to do something, because nobody would be doing the complicated way if they were an easy way to do it, because they needed to get it done in a time frame.
Right.
So they're going to be doing it, and it's the conversation about all two together. So it's just a straightforward knit two together. Because on fine lace, why would you do a left leaning decrease? Because the knit two together is much faster.
Right.
You've got your knitting belt, you've got your rippy string, and you've got your two together, and off you go.
Right.
Isn't it? It's that speed for people making it. So have I not answered your question? Probably.
You absolutely did. No, I think you made a lot of good points in there. And one of the reasons why I wanted to have you on for this episode specifically is because you have some talks coming up that you've put together as part of your advocacy for Shetland lace. Do you want to share about those talks coming up?
I'm going to do two talks, just they're both on the same thing, but just at different times. I'm going to do a talk about Shetland haps, just a little bit about history. But there's obviously some brilliant books out there that go in much more in depth about the history of haps and everything else. What I'm going to do is talking a bit about the history of haps, but also the same thing about the heritage of haps, how it has gone through my family and that relationship that making haps has had with myself, and how that's been passed down, and now it's been passed down to me, and then I'm now doing those classes online, and it's just looking at how they're differently constructed, how you can put them together differently, discussing the Betsy join, and it's just a bit it's a bit of everything. It's history, construction, and just a general chat about Shetland lace. Because in Shetland lace, it's got lots of different bits, doesn't it? It's not just haps, it's not just scarves or shawls or hats, mittens, gloves. There's lots of different. So it's just picking one thing that obviously at the moment I'm really into through my classes where we knit a mini hap, and just picking one tiny area really. And also linking in language and dialect and everything else, and just having an overview. And hopefully people might find it interesting. So rather than just getting your hat pattern from the wool brokers, buying your pattern in your wool, is just kind of where it's kind of like that, a bit of the history and culture. So that was kind of, lots of people tell me they're interested in that. And I just thought, might be interesting to do some talks on it and see if encourage some more people to pick up their needles.
Well, I love that. That's one of my favorite parts about Shetland Wool Week is the talks about the history behind the knitting and the wool that happens. And so I'm really happy to hear that you're bringing that. It's wonderful to have the focus on the crafts in the classes, and to learn and to carry the actual handiwork forward to the next generation. But I think it's also helpful and important to learn the history, the heritage part that's behind the craft, and to keep that knowledge going forward too. So I think that I got very excited when you reached out to tell me that you were doing these. I was like, yeah, okay. Started reposting and went and got signed up first. Made sure I was signed up first, and then I started reposting and sharing.
Because what I love doing, so when I was at Shetland Wool Week this year, I was demonstrating up at the Oliberry happening. But what I really enjoyed was actually meeting everybody, meeting all the visitors and talking to everybody. But I also really enjoyed that quiet moment before we opened. Then I got to chat to all the women that was there knitting and demonstrating, and I got to speak to them and hear their stories. And sometimes I'd be sitting there and they'd be talking to people that were asking from all over the world, and they were being asking questions, and I'm sitting there like this. I'm listening too. And is it rude if I've now got a question, or will I wait till can I ask a question, or do I have to wait till later? Because then it shows that I'm interrupting their conversation. and it's lovely, and I love hearing just this stories, and people are just so willing to share
Yeah.
all their family history and information about knitting and everything else. And they think it's not interesting. I think a lot of people think it's not that interesting, but it really, well, I find it really interesting. But then I suppose that I agree with you. I like the history as well as the knitting. I like the history of it. I love the culture in Shetland and where we come from. We just come, like a lot of us, we come from just totally different bits of all come together to make a special little culture. And I love talking to people, especially in America and other places, because the same way people have come from all over to end up to where your family is now based, but that's not necessarily where all the different bits and then that all bring together. And then now you've got your special like family history and everything else, and it makes us all unique. So it's just I had a great time listening in, and also being able to just talk and hear their stories about their grandmothers and family members and everything else. I really enjoyed. And when so my mother and I did a talk at Wool Week, the stories that my mother came out with was ones I'd never even heard of before, because it was certain prompts that people asked specific questions that I haven't thought to ask her.
Yeah.
And so she was telling stories that was going, okay, so see, when we went through like what we were going to talk about at this like talk, you never mentioned any of these things. But it was prompted by other questions.
Yeah.
So even within my own relationship with my mother and family, there's so much rich stories and everything else within that. And likewise, and we're not unique. I'm not unique in this. I'm a person from Shetland, and there's so many people that could be exactly like me, and they're passionate about Shetland, they're passionate about knitting, and they've got amazing family histories of knitting. And I know that, and I've seen people's knitting, and it's amazing and everything else. And I know they've got that same rich heritage and history within their own families. So I'm not, and that's the thing, we're really lucky in Shetland. I'm not unique in any shape or form. There's so many people like me that and better than me at knitting and everything else that's doing it, and they've got that same strong bond to family and history as well.
Yeah. That is one of the favorite things. The feedback from tour members is for each of our tours, we incorporate a time when it's not a class. We just invite local knitters to come and knit with us. And people are welcome to ask them questions, and they just share their life experiences and their knitting. Sometimes it's, family history. Sometimes it's, let me show you this little technique or whatever. And it's a very casual knit along time. But that's hands down a favorite every time for people, is that time to just sit and talk to the local knitters and get a sense of their knitting history and their experiences and their family's experience, and just have those questions answered. Yeah, it's wonderful. And I know that goes on without us there. I know that people still get together, as knitters there without the tourists around, and still have those the knitting times. And I think, that's so important too, because that's part of the heritage. The knitting heritage is that time to get together and exchange, your thoughts and ideas and techniques and all of that. But so you have the talks coming up. Spaces are very limited, but if people find that they, I will put a link in the show notes, but if people find that it's sold out, they should send you an email and say they're interested, and maybe we can convince Elizabeth to do these talks again for us. And you did mention that you will be offering this talk at Shetland Wool Week.
A variation of, because obviously I couldn't persuade my mum to come online. So this one is about haps, but it's more just from it's more like a family history and more of an overview rather than because obviously the talk that we did at Wool Week, we had lots of examples of haps so people can look at. Else so this I'll have lots of photos which are nice, but it's not quite the same. But at Wool Week, Mum and I are going to do another talk about obviously lace knitting this year.
will be an excellent chance to see some of these beautiful shawls in person and try not to drool on them. And
I'll try not to throw them on the floor.
Yeah, show respect, Elizabeth. But so any other plans in the future as you're looking to promote Shetland Lace? Are we looking at a book here, Elizabeth? What are we looking at?
I can knit. I'm not very good at writing. It would be good. That would be nice just to get. What would I love to do is get lots of stories from lots of people. But what I've got coming up is I've got my online classes. I've obviously got my mini HAP classes. But I've got also other ones of how to correct mistakes in lace knitting, which was very popular last time I put that on. So I've been asked to put it on again. I've got also one on how to knit lace edging, the traditional Shetland way. And I'm just at the moment trying to focus a lot on doing some patterns and doing some new designs and everything else. And that's the thing with Shetland lace, it all takes time. They're not quick patterns and designs. So I'm slowly working on some designs, and I'm working closely with my mum as well on some of her own designs and everything else. So hopefully we will get my mother persuaded to start doing some more, because she just makes the most beautiful haps. She really does. And so hopefully we can get her persuaded to produce some patterns as well, which would be great
too. She's a delightful person as well. Not only is she a magnificent lace knitter, she's just a delightful person. And I really enjoyed the talk that the two of you did this last year, and I'm looking forward to the class and really anything else that you do, Elizabeth. I am here for. I'm ready for it. And I will say I was in a previous life, I was an editor. So when the book is ready for editing, you just let me know. And I'm happy to help. Anything I can do to smooth the way for that.
There's just not enough hours in the day, and
I know.
No, but thank you so much, because this is just a wonderful time to have had a chat and speak about Shetland lace. Obviously, I could speak for hours, all about lace and knitting. But it's that my main aim at the moment is just to preserve, look after Shetland lace, and by talking about it and doing things like this, is just raise awareness of it. And if we can keep it off that red list, would be wonderful. I think it still is going to be difficult, because obviously people making a living from knitting is always going to be hard. But what I love is the amount of people in Shetland who are now learning to knit again, from that generation that didn't learn. Like, I was really lucky, I learned at school, and they were a generation that really didn't. But it's my mother does the HAP classes in Shetland, and how many women come to those classes and are relearning that they were taught to learn to knit when they were younger, but are all coming back to knitting. And I know that the Onst Hazel Lawson has been doing started doing after are starting to do lace classes again as well, and that's just wonderful to hear that all that stuff is all re-happening again. It's just really exciting that people are getting involved in it.
It is. So, well, I think when the report first came out, I think it was pretty shocking to people to see that, and so I've been glad to see the upswell of support that Shetland lace has been getting. Again, heritage crafts around the world, as we learn about people passing on or losing interest or whatever, that those of us who have the time and energy and interest, that we give it that boost that it needs by being interested and encouraging people who have the knowledge, to teach us more.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, thank you, Elizabeth. It was great talking to you.
I hope you found that chat as valuable as I did. There are so many crafts out there that are teetering on the edge because there are so few people who still do them. I think we're all aware of that. Every year, there are crafts that disappear because people pass away without passing on their knowledge, because there wasn't anyone who wanted to learn. And that is a true shame because that knowledge is part of our human history and there is value in preserving it, not just for the beauty that it provides or the usefulness of the finished object, but the knowledge itself can actually inform the other crafts and science and literature and other forms of culture in our lives. But I think Elizabeth made a strong argument as well for the importance of preserving a core knowledge of a heritage craft and not letting it get watered down by outside influences. By all means, draw on the inspiration of these different heritage crafts. That's one way that people feel motivated to keep learning about them. But also, as they use this inspiration, designers need to respect the craft for what it is. Don't invent new things and label it as part of the tradition. Don't take part of the tradition and rename it something else for your own purposes. Don't hide your sources. It's okay to draw inspiration from established traditions. That's been going on for millennia. But be honest about your sources, because when you do, that points people back to that original source craft. It encourages folks to look back at the heritage craft and learn more and keep that source flourishing. My knitting heart resides in Shetland. I think that's pretty clear. And I look forward to seeing the output from the Shetland Lace project currently underway from the Shetland Museum and Archives. And I look forward to supporting Elizabeth Williamson in her efforts to preserve Shetland lace, as well as seeking out ways to support other Shetland lace knitters who honor the continuum of knowledge and those designers who draw inspiration from Shetland lace and properly attribute their work. But remember, this is just one form of heritage craft out there that faces these issues. There are many, many more. When I was in Wales last month, I met a gentleman who was one of 2 remaining clog makers in the country. And he said that the other fellow was 20 years older than he was. And the only reason either of them make a living at it is because they worked for historical sites that covered their wages. So that shoemaking, that specific Welsh shoemaking technique is on its way out. If you have the time and inclination, might I suggest that you consider being a bridge in the continuum? Elizabeth mentioned in our talk that people stopped getting knitting lessons in the schools in Shetland. They are back for the students who are interested, thanks to the work of the Shetland Piri-Mackers, and I'll put a link in the show notes if you want to support them. But there is a generation in Shetland who didn't receive the training in the traditional way. Luckily, there were people who carried it forward, and interest is picked up again before that knowledge was lost. That doesn't always happen for different heritage crafts. I'll put a link to the Heritage Craft Association in the UK in the show notes. You can also Google for heritage crafts and the area you live in. I did that for Connecticut and came up with a blog post that someone had put together a list of the different crafts that had been done in this area. I'm probably not going to be able to take up pewter working, but I know there are still people who are doing glass and ceramics, and the end of the blog post even had a list of places where you could sign up for classes in different areas around Connecticut. So there are people out there working to preserve these heritage crafts in local areas. Get out there and find someone who is teaching them and ask to be taught. You might not make a living at it yourself, but you might learn enough to help preserve the craft for the next generation. A few more things before I go. First, you may have noticed that this is episode 97. That means that we are 3 episodes away from episode 100. In all honesty, I was just going to let it go by without comment, but a few friends, independent of one another, noticed the upcoming landmark and told me I needed to do something special. So I have decided that what I would really like to do for episode 100 is hear from you. I have set up a Google Voice account and would like to invite you to call in and leave a voicemail. While you look for a pen to write down the number, I'll let you know what I'm looking for. I would like to hear from you something that you have learned from the show or found valuable, or something that sent you down a rabbit hole and what you learned there, or just something you enjoyed on the show or because of the show. Keep it to a few minutes, and keep in mind I may need to edit your comments. I really would love to hear your thoughts. The number to call is 860-281-2888. 2437. If you're outside of the US or Canada, I believe you have to add a +1 to the start of that. Again, 860-281-2437. Be sure to leave your first name, and if you'd like, you can share where you're calling from. Again, 860-281-2437. If it would be long distance or international for you, you can sign up for a Google Voice account yourself. It's free, and use that to call in, and it should be a free call. Because I have the tours coming up, I'm going to need your messages by April 4th to put the 100th episode together. So please write down the number, jot down a thought or two, and go ahead and give me a call while you're thinking about it. 860-281-2437. Second, just a quick reminder that the December mystery yarn boxes will be back this year, and those are going on sale in early May. I have one designer working on it this time who's creating something for us using the yarn from 5 of the wool makers in Shetland. They will all be fingering weight / jumper weight / 4-ply Shetland wool. More details are coming up on that soon, so watch for that. That is all for now, everyone. I will be back again in 2 weeks with a good old-fashioned catch-up episode. We've had 3 interviews in a row with some really fascinating people, but I just want to check in and say hi. So that's coming up next time. In the meantime, thank you for listening and knitting with me for a bit. If you'd like to support the show, check the show notes for ways to make that happen. Special thanks to my patrons, Knit New Haven and Morehouse Farm, for sponsoring the podcast. The show notes are also where you will find links to any reference materials or links I mentioned as I put the show together, so be sure to check those out. Find me on my social media accounts as I Thought I Knew How, except on Twitter, where it's just Thought I Knew How. The groups on various platforms are all called I Thought I Knew How Podcast. Until next time, may you be blessed with stitches that never drop, yarn without joins, and plenty of time to knit.